Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can support me at Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, Locals, and also check out my Substack. So I have heard no word from Logos. I don't know what's going on right now, but since it's already been 2 weeks since our last episode, I feel like it needs to happen. The other thing is it's really windy where I'm at, and the internet has been going in and out, so hopefully we can make this work. Okay, so How Dawkins Got Pwned, Chapter 2. A brief period of vagrancy and reflection, mostly in a disconnected state. I got back the other day and actually hesitated for a couple of days to look at the comment thread on Chapter 1, which I dispatched with more than usual rambling and carelessness. From pals in Portland, Mrs. Moldbug and I got on the R1100R and took a motorcycle pilgrimage to Chris McClandis's bus, where we stayed up 3 nights in a row, just thinking, then did a bunch of acid and emptied our pistols manically into the woods. Smoke that moose, we were chanting. Get them maggots, smoke that moose. Anyway, dude, I don't know what goes on inside Moldbug's brain. I don't even know if Moldbug knows what goes on inside of his brain. Anyway, I didn't expect many comments on Chapter 1. It's really only the first part of the argument, and it would be charitable to call it a first draft. Fortunately, the practice known in what calls itself the real world as editing is considered unethical on a blog, and rightly so. So I was delighted to see the conversation that ensued. It strikes me as one of the best UR threads so far, and hopefully I don't need to repeat my appreciation for the quality of the discussion here. The commentators have certainly done a fine job of figuring out where I'm going with this. If I start with any suspense, it's gone, but please indulge me when I restate the argument in my own words, if only for clarity of further discussion. Okay, we have Voltra, GF, Arnav Jindal, Chess Stricken, and Cyber Ninja Zero. Well, hello, everybody. Let's, Okay, my hypothesis is that Professor Dawkins is not just an atheist, he is a Christian atheist, or as I prefer to put it, a non-theist Christian. His Einsteinian religion is no more or no less than the dominant present-day current of Christianity itself. M.42, as commenter Farr so concisely put it, there's a good reason why the current dominant version of the Minotaur, to use the term by Bertrand de Juvenal, shall use a previous version as its sparring partner. So as to win power, the previous version is precisely what it had to fight and win against to begin with. Let us call the current Minotaur M.42 and call its immediate predecessor M.41, so that M.42 could win over M.41. It has to take on M.41, discredit it, win it over, and thus for a while M.41 is still dominant. Well, M.42 is actually a subversive. Then M.42 gains dominance, but still has M.41 as a serious rival against which to vie for power. When the victory is complete and irreversible, M.41 is a favorite sacrificial goat. It's so much fun to hit a hapless victim when your technique is perfected. Of course, by the time you're there, the version of M.41 you're kicking in the head has devolved a lot and is no more than arrogant M.41B of your youth. Sure of its power, it is a pitiful M.41Y of today, near the end of the line. If we accept this hypothesis, the conclusion that Professor Dawkins has been pwned strikes me as quite incontrovertible. He thinks he is attacking superstition on behalf of the armies of reason. In fact, he is attacking M.41 on behalf of the armies of M.42. Doe. Okay. See, this is where I take disagreement. He says here that M.42 is a lot like M.41, and then it has to fight something in order to give it. Yeah, here we go. Gains dominance, but still has a serious rival which would vie for power. So, on the one hand, I can agree that there are elements of Christianity that have, as of 2007, though now as of 2023, we've got a long way in discarding some of those elements of Christianity that were even held by secular society. The real quote thing that M.42 is fighting is ethnic identity, right? The ever-present vast right-wing conspiracy of white militias. That's the real thing that they're quote fighting, which doesn't really exist. And that's what gives it legitimacy, right? Yes, there was a lot of Christian bashing in the aughts, but the real issue here was to take a stand against this non-existent threat, which was this quote-unquote vast right-wing conspiracy of white supremacist militias, going back to the Clinton years. Of course, I'm sure Professor Dawkins is quite sincere in his beliefs. Hosts always are. However, he has devoted a remarkable level of ratiocinative attention to one phenotypical insignificant meme, the God delusion, in which M.42 conflicts with M.41. My view is that this behavior is best explained by mimetic infection, i.e. ponage. I share Professor Dawkins' preference for the derived M.42 meme, at least as this one spot on the chromosome. But I can't help observing that A, M.42 and M.41 are both large and intricate memeplexes. B, it strikes me as by no means obvious that when M.42 and M.41 are compared in toto, M.42 is more reasonable or less morbid than M.41. C, M.42, like M.41, includes many other memes which replicate via the same irrational indoctrination paths as the God delusion. And D, while some of the M.42 and M.41 memes are quite reasonable, others strike me as inadequately examined at best, transparently preposterous at worst. Now, in light of the woke insurgency within the universities and people like Lindsay and Boghossian fighting back, ineffectually, of course, this does seem to give some credence to what Moldbug is saying here. There are elements of the M.42, the secular humanist rationalist memeplex, that has since gotten away from the new atheists, and they're not in control of the narrative anymore. Ergo, opposing Professor Dawkins is quite adaptive for M.42. It focuses potential hosts on the question of whether M.42 is superior to M.41 on this particular point, as it clearly is. Okay, again, how is this guy right-wing, and why do trad cats love him? I don't know. Moving on. This distracts them from considering the more general and interesting question of whether or not M.42, considered by itself, is stark raving bonkers, and if so, constructing a reasonable perspective which is reassembled from scratch, which could correct both M.42 and M.41. I would love to see Professor Dawkins rotate his impressive intellectual artillery to this angle, but if I'm right that his neocortex has been devoured and replaced by a foam of M.42 cysts, I wouldn't exactly hold my breath. Megaloperna photons to the white curtsy phone. Well, also it's funny, right? Because of Dawkins' own attempt to stem the tide of the woke, he got his humanist award revoked because he was labeled a transphobe. So, he that's it. They were fighting the wrong battle. Clearly, any revival of the religious right was not going to happen. It was delusional to think that it could. And the real threat was being fomented in the very university system that these guys were defending. My interpretation makes sense if and only if the following claims are sensible. The concept of non-theistic Christianity is coherent. Einsteinian religion is best classified as the sect of non-theistic Christianity. This sect is the most successful version of Christianity today. It includes propositions which are inconsistent with reason. These propositions are associated with significant morbidity. This chapter examines claims 1 through 3. We will take a look at claims 4 and 5 starting in chapter 3. Before considering these claims, let's adjust our terms a little. Precise thinking requires clear, emotionally neutral, and aesthetically elegant terminology. While in general I buy the Dawkinsian model of memetics, I think it falls short on all these counts. Let's call memeplex stable enough to propagate across generations of tradition. Not only is this an actual word in the actual English language, It also has the virtue of being non-judgmental. Surely anyone who is not a complete foaming-at-the-mouth fanatic or whatever persuasion can admit that the word contains both good traditions and bad traditions. An individual infected by such a memeplex is a host who subscribes to the tradition. If the subject and object must be reversed, the tradition directs the host. An institution which propagates some tradition is a repeater of that tradition. The name of a tradition is a label. Specific features of traditions can be called themes. For example, the God theme is a trait of many traditions. The Trinity theme is a trait of many Christian traditions. Traditions can be taxonomically grouped and classified along the lines of Professor Dawkins' biological analogy, and we can follow the analogy in calling a group of related traditions a clade. Different versions of a single related theme are variants. A set of themes transmitted as a unit can be called a haplotheme, an analogy with the genetic haplotype. Any two themes which cannot simultaneously direct one individual conflict. We can also follow biology in referring to ancestral and derived variants and borrow other terminology from Cladistics. And the set of themes an individual subscribes to is that individual's kernel. Okay, so before I go on, I know why he's using all these biological terms, and before that, the technological computer terms. But I just don't think these are at all remotely relevant to discussing ideas. Ideas are not biological organisms that reproduce. It's just that simple. Like many simple bacteria, traditions have no reproductive barriers. They can exchange themes across clade lines or introgress. Thus, their taxonomy is strictly speaking not a tree, but a lattice, a dag, a bush, etc. As in biology, however, introgression is often insignificant at the 30,000-foot level, and we can usually get away with ignoring it. If a theme makes a substantial claim about reality, Hume's is, we can call it factual or mundane. If it makes a moral statement about right and wrong, Hume's ought, we call it ethical. If it makes neither, we can call it metaphysical. Well, what's funny about this, right, is where he puts Hume, right? Most trad cats are Thomists, and most of them hate Hume. So again, I'm still left scratching my chin as to why a guy who's, because right, if Hume and Hume's metaphysics and everything that comes from Hume is the problem, as they will tell you, how does Moldbug get it right? In spite of Hume, that's never been answered. If a theme is not justified by reason, we can call it irrational. Metaphysical themes are irrational by definition. Well, if you want to play word games, Moldbug, sure, but who's going to accept that? Mundane themes are irrational if they depend on logical fallacies or violate Occam's razor. No single ethical theme can be irrational, but a set of ethical themes is irrational if it ascribes mutually inconsistent ethical values to a single action. While any action can be either right or wrong, no action can be both right and wrong. If a tradition causes its host to make miscalculations that compromise their personal goals, it exhibits necessity and morbidity. If it causes its host to act in a way that compromises their genes, reproductive interests, it exhibits a Darwinian morbidity. Well, I guess on this scale, modern civilization is just a Darwinian morbidity since no one's reproducing. If subscribing to the tradition is individually advantageous or neutral, defectors are rewarded or at least unpunished. But collectively harmful, the tradition is parasitic. If subscribing is individually disadvantageous but collectively beneficial, the tradition is altruistic. If it is both individually and collectively benign, it is symbiotic. If it is both individually and collectively harmful, it is malignant. Each of these labels can be applied to either Misesian or Darwinian morbidity. A theme that is irrational but does not exhibit either Misesian or Darwinian morbidity is a trivially morbid. So let's see, Misesian. Okay, so goals and reproduction. Okay. Thus, one might translate the part of Professor Dawkins' argument I agree with as the claim that the God theme is irrational because the variant in which God interacts with earthly affairs is mundane and fallacious, being unsubstantiated and unfalsifiable, and the variant in which God does not interact with earthly affairs is metaphysical. At least in the latter form, I see the God theme as trivially morbid. Professor Dawkins disagrees. He associates various Misesian and Darwinian morbidities, parasitic and malignant, which various historical variants of the God theme. I see this as the result of confusing theme and haplotheme. So let's see here. He says, because. Right. Well, I mean, this is just clearly question begging. I mean, unsubstantiated and unfalsifiable. To whom? I mean, unless you just want to go full Matt Dillahunty and say, I'm not convinced, then, I doubt we're dealing with an honest actor. And frankly, I do. And frankly, Moldbug has given us a lot of reasons to suspect he's not an honest actor. My counter argument is that Professor Dawkins' Einsteinian religion is the most successful modern-day tradition in the Christian faith, that it includes many irrational themes, and that this tradition, evaluated as a whole, exhibits a Misesian parasitic morbidity and a Darwinian malignant morbidity. Well, the other thing too, given his claim about morbidity, let's see, compromises people's personal goals, compromises their reproductive interests. Religion in general and Christianity in particular would have to be the opposite of what Moldbug calls a Darwinian morbidity, because they're the only people reproducing. And as far as personal goals, I mean, I guess, if you want like maximal libertarianism, okay, maybe that would be conflicting with Misesian morbidity, but I guess it depends on your goals. And so I don't think it would be morbid in either of the two senses as Moldbug has laid it out. Okay, where were we? Therefore, I believe it needs to be terminated with extreme prejudice. I'm relatively unconcerned about other Christian traditions, like consider them of negligible present-day political power, and therefore negligible collective morbidity, though of course the situation could always change. Now, I remember the sort of like scaremongering in the aughts about the rise of the religious right, and really that's never completely gone away. It still kind of exists. So this is one area in which Moldbug was absolutely right. There was really no threat to the status quo posed by Christians in America. There just wasn't. And so that's interesting that he sees it. And again, he's basically a new atheist. That's what he says he is. And nobody else really seemed to see that from that circle, which is interesting. Fortified by this doxology, let's get back to demonstrating ponage. Our first essential claim is that the concept of non-theistic Christianity is not, as most readers would probably assume at first glance, self-contradictory or meaningless. This is very easy to see. In the biological analogy, non-theistic Christianity is a phrase in the same sense as a flightless bird or a bipedal tetrapod. The adjective in this phrase is morphological, the noun is taxonomic, there is no contradiction at all. Professor Dawkins is hoisted by his own petard here. Since the biological analogy is his own invention, he cannot possibly object to the application of the modern cladistic method. If we classify traditions according to a single morphological feature, the God theme might as well classify both birds and bats as flying warm-blooded animals. Perhaps this was good enough for Aristotle, but it's certainly not good enough for Professor Dawkins. We can watch Eliezer Yudkowsky, who for all his faults is certainly an intelligent young man, falling into this trap here. He implicitly classifies a wide variety of historical traditions as either theistic or non-theistic, just as a naive taxonomist might classify animals as flying or non-flying, bipedal or quadrupedal, etc. Yudkowsky's defense, this confusion which is inherent in the usual modern use of the word religion, is so common as to be conventional. But that doesn't make it cogent. Overcome that bias, Eliezer. You can do it. In my opinion, the only sensible way to classify traditions as with species is by ancestral structure. While the existence of introgression and the absence of reproductive isolation make it technically impossible to construct a precise cladogram of human traditional society history, we can certainly produce sensible approximations. Note that perhaps an even better analogy is to languages and linguistic history, in which cladistic classification is commonplace. So Professor Dawkins is an atheist, but as his writing makes plain, atheism is not the only theme in his personal kernel. Professor Dawkins believes in many other things. He labels the tradition to which he describes as Einsteinian religion. Since no one else has used this label, he is entitled to define Einsteinian religion. Perhaps we can just call it Einsteinianism as whatever he wants, and he has. My observation is that Einsteinianism exhibits many synapomorphies with Christianity. For example, it appears that Professor Dawkins believes in the fair distribution of goods, the futility of violence, the universal brotherhood of man, and the reification of community. This might be labeled as the themes Rawlsianism, pacifism, fraternalism, and communalism. Well, okay. This goes back to what I already was mad at Moldbug for his idiotic definition of Protestantism and Christianity. But frankly, without getting into that again, this is just stupid. Like, the neocons did not, I'm sorry, the new atheists obviously believed in the utility of violence. Almost all of them were beating the war drums for the war in Iraq. Sam Harris threatened, to nuke Mecca. He said, it might be necessary to nuke Mecca at some point. Christopher Hitchens was in favor of the war. And I don't know if Dawkins was necessarily an overtly hawkish. I know Harris and Hitchens were more. But he doesn't believe in the futility of violence. And as far as the fair distribution of goods, most new atheists were capitalist and probably believed in some sort of a safety net. For example, so did Hayek. But again, they're not Marxists. They're not, socialists. Universal brotherhood of man. Yeah, probably. And communalism, the reification of this is insane. Like, maybe Dawkins could be pinned for the universal brotherhood of man, but that's it. And none of these other things really fall on Dawkins. Because when I read fair distribution of goods, I think of in the parlance that was being used in the aughts, socialism, communism. And that's not Dawkins at all. Not in the slightest. Following these first two links above will take you to UR discussions of these themes in which I outline their evolutionary history and the Christian clade and make a case for their morbidity. I have not yet discussed fraternalism and communalism, but I say a little about them later. If nothing else, they are certainly very easy to find in the Bible. Well, again, going back to his definition of morbidity, the Christian religion is obviously not morbid. It's not Darwinianly morbid because it facilitates reproduction. Now, again, maybe Moldbug will get to that later in this particular discussion, but the Einsteinian religion, or whatever he wants to call it, Dawkins' beliefs, that is a Darwinian morbidity because they don't reproduce. Simple as. So we'll see. If Professor Dawkins were not a Christian atheist, but rather a Confucian or Buddhist atheist, or even an Islamic atheist, some clades of Sufi come daringly close to this, rara avis, we would not expect to see these obvious synapomorphies with Christianity. Instead, we would expect to see synapomorphies with Confucianism, Buddhism, or Islam. We would have to construct a historical explanation of how these faiths made it to Cambridge. Fortunately, we are sparing this onerous task. Okay, hold on a second. I'm going to look something up, guys. Richard Dawkins, Iraq War. I want to see what his position on the Iraq War was, because most of the new atheists were supportive of the war. Right, interesting. So Dawkins was opposed to the Iraq War. This is from Wikipedia, because he claims we were lied into it, but he supported the war in Afghanistan. So his opposition to the Iraq War was something you might find with a lot of leftists at the time, but supporting the Afghan war and fighting terrorism generally. I mean, this is not pacifism. This is not the futility of violence. This is stupid for him to say that. Non-theistic Christianity, therefore, can describe any tradition in the Christian clade in which the ancestral God theme has been replaced by the derived theme of atheism or agnosticism. This is no more surprising than the replacement of the ancestral Trinitarian theme, which was a part of all significant Christian traditions for 1,000 years, with the derived Unitarian theme. Every variant of Christianity, by definition, considers itself orthodox, and as such, it must question the legitimacy of any other Christian tradition which contains conflicting themes. To a good Trinitarian, circa 1807, a Unitarian was simply not a Christian. Today, while most Christian traditions still officially conform to Trinitarianism, few spend a huge amount of time worrying about the Holy Ghost. If more examples are needed, denying the divinity of Jesus is another obvious intermediate form between Christian theism and Christian atheism. We can also ignore the fact that Professor Dawkins does not classify Einsteinianism as a form of Christianity. and nor do any non-Einsteinian Christian traditions. Clearly accepting a tradition's classification of itself or of its competitors is foolish in the extreme. These minor thematic features are best explained adaptively. For example, it would be maladaptive for Einsteinianism to self-classify as Christian. One of the most adaptive features of M.42 is that non-theistic or secular Christianity can be propagated by American official institutions, which are constitutionally prohibited from endorsing its ancestor and competitor. M.41 or theistic Christianity, considering as the set includes the most influential repeater network in the world, the U.S. educational system, it's hard to see what could justify abandoning such a replicative advantage. It would also be maladaptive for theistic Christianity to classify non-theistic Christianity as Christian. Wait, M.41 deploys the unchristian nature of its enemy, the dreaded secular humanism, as a rallying point for its dwindling band of followers. If Einsteinian religion were Christian, M.41 would have to define it, increasingly ineffective counterattack not as a defense of faith, but as a more theological spat. Once this may have had some resonance, but in the world where God himself is under fire, it's hard to excite anyone over such sectarian minutiae. It would be maladaptive for theistic Christianity to classify non-theistic Christianity as Christian. Right, okay, all right. Therefore, I conclude that claim 1 is satisfied. Non-theistic Christianity is a sensible concept. As for 2, I've already described some of the links between Einsteinianism and Christianity. Let's sharpen this claim, however, by proposing a hypothetical chain of events that outlines the exact historical connection. My belief is that Richard Dawkins is not just a Christian atheist, he is a Protestant atheist, and he's not just a Protestant atheist, he's a Calvinist atheist. He's not just a Calvinist atheist, he's an Anglo-Calvinist atheist. In other words, he can also be described as a Puritan atheist, a dissenter atheist, a nonconformist atheist, an evangelical, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is all really stupid because Dawkins was raised in the Church of England. And if anything, he carries with him the sensibilities of the Church of England, which is sort of the opposite of these more radical elements. So it's just, I think also Peter and Christopher Hitchens were raised in the Church of England as well. So, I mean, this is just stupid. Like, we know where they were getting raised growing up as children. This cladistic taxonomy traces Professor Dawkins' intellectual ancestry back about 400 years to the era of the English Civil War. Except, of course, for the atheist theme, Professor Dawkins' kernel is a remarkable match for the ranter, leveler, digger, Quaker, fifth monarchist, or any more extreme English dissenter, traditions that flourished during the Cromwellian interregnum. I mean, this is so stupid. The diggers wanted socialism. As far as I know, Richard Dawkins doesn't advocate for common ownership of property. Fifth monarchists, some sort of succession issue. Dawkins doesn't concern himself with that. Quakers, absolutely not. Maybe the levelers, since they were like proto-liberals. Again, this is just really bad. And again, where was Dawkins' education? The Church of England. Frankly, these dudes are freaks, monomaniacal fanatics. Any mainstream English thinker of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century informed that this tradition or its modern descendant is now the planet's dominant Christian denomination would regard this as a sign of immediate apocalypse. If you're sure they're wrong, you're more sure than me. Fortunately, Cromwell himself was a comparatively moderate. The extreme ultra-Puritan sects never got a solid lock on power under the Protectorate. Even more fortunately, Cromwell got old and died, and Cromwellianism died with him. Lawful government was restored to England as the Church of England, and dissenters became a marginal fringe again. And frankly, a damn good riddance it was. Again, Dawkins was raised in the Church of England. This is just, I don't know what to say. This is just so stupid. However, we can't keep a good parasite down. A community of Puritans fled to America and founded the theocratic colonies of New England. Again, this is stupid. Theocracy means the rule of clerics in the state. Puritan New England did not allow ministers to hold political office, unlike in Iran, which is the actual theocracy. Or, I might add, the Papal States, where the Pope was the head of state and not just the head of the Catholic Church. After its military victories in the American Revolution and the War of Succession, American Puritanism was well on the way to world domination. Its victories in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War confirmed its global hegemony. All legitimate mainstream thought on Earth today is descended from the American Puritans and through them the English dissenters. So there is one element here that I think Moldbug is badly mangling. So in my libertarian days, Murray Rothbard, he has the whole idea that post-millennialism is within the Christian tradition, both Catholic and Protestant, is the sort of precursor to revolutionary Marxism. And I think some case can be made for that. And Rothbard discusses these aspects of post-millennialism. So he doesn't identify it with any one given Christian tradition, since, not all Catholics and not all Protestants are post-millennial. Some are. And he views it. I think that's where Moldbug is getting this from, but Rothbard makes an overall better point. Let me see if I can find the Rothbard article. Let me see. It's been a long time, so maybe not. Maybe I can't find it. But yeah, there's some stuff here. This is from, wow, when was this? It's an old Lou Rockwell article. This is from Rothbard, the key to the intricate and massive system of, this is millennial communism. The key to the intricate and massive system of thought created by Karl Marx is at the bottom a simple one. Karl Marx was a communist. Okay. Skipping down. In the same way as the return of the Messiah and Christian theology was put an end to history and established a new heaven and new earth, so the establishment of communism would put an end to human history. And just as for post-millennial Christians, man, led by God's prophets and saints, would establish a kingdom of God on earth, and for premillennials, Jesus would have many human assistants in establishing such a kingdom, so for Marx and other schools of communist mankind, led by a vanguard of secular saints, would establish a secularizing kingdom on the earth. Now again, Rothbard here is making a specific, discrete claim about some view of the millennium as a theological underpinning that later mutates into communism, which I think that is where Moldbug is getting this from, but it got really garbled and messed up. So, yeah, it's a mess. Of course, this tradition evolved over time. Its theology took significant steps toward modern secularism in the form of Unitarianism, which deleted the Trinity and other points of Calvinist doctrine, and especially under Transcendentalism, which elided the nasty idea of hell and declared that God loves everyone. Many of Professor Dawkins' reveries about Einsteinian pantheistic nature, grandeur, are reminiscent of Emerson, who was trained as a Unitarian minister. During and after the War of Secession, New England Christianity established a cozy relationship with the federal government, which it has continued to the present day, under such labels as liberalism and progressivism. Well, I love it. I love how he talks about New England Christianity. Yeah, well, you know what the dominant Christian group in New England today is? Catholics. Irish and Italian. I mean, there aren't even any Puritans left. This is why it's such a stupid theory. We have, Supreme Court. I think like all but two are Catholic. One's a Jew and one is a Black Protestant. So, yeah, I mean, this is ridiculous. Two new histories of this process, though they are written by conservatives and thus become hopelessly confused after World War II, are David Gelernter's Americanism and George McKenna's Puritan Origins of American Patriotism. I've only just started the latter, but so far I find it's far superior, and I say this though I love Gelernter to death. The same phenomena was ably defined by Murray Rothbard as postmillennial pietism. Yeah, I just talked about postmillennial pietism, guys, and what Rothbard's talking about is not exactly what Moldbug's talking about. Well, there are some superficial similarities. For a snapshot of this terrifying militaristic theocracy in action around World War I, try Richard Gamble's The War for Righteousness. Most people probably don't know that the original noun which joined the adjective progressive was Christianity. For an especially unusual 4.41 flavored look at the American Puritanism, replicating in its favorite niche government school, check out R.J. Rushdoony's Messianic Character of American Education. Well, see, this is what's really interesting, right? R.J. Rushdoony was a prominent actual neo-Calvinist who was the godfather behind what's now called the theonomy movement. So again, Moldbug just clearly doesn't know what he's talking about. Rushdoony and his followers would have seen themselves as the descendants of the Puritans. I mean, they still say that today. For example, Doug Wilson, who, again, when we looked at, I think it was Why I'm Not an Anti-Semite or something like that, where he was, explaining to people why he chose the term neo-Calvinism or ultra-Calvinism or whatever. I mean, for crying out loud, Doug Wilson debated Christopher Hitchens. There's no way he didn't know about Doug Wilson if he's in the new atheist sphere. So, again, this is just clearly obfuscation to direct attention away from other, more pertinent actors. And for a primary source view of this tradition at the last point in history, at which it had the humility to classify itself as mere religion rather than absolute righteousness and truth, see one of my favorite examples, the Time article magazine entitled article American Malvern from 1942, written in the lifetime, as they used to say, of those now living. What's so interesting about the American Malvern is that it describes a recognizably progressive political program in religious terms as super Protestant. Professor Dawkins would certainly qualify as a super Protestant by its definition. Of course, Professor Dawkins is not an American, but English, sharing a language and a culture. However, American Puritanism and the broader clade of American mainline Protestants and the English dissenters evolved largely as a single community. For example, in the War of Secession, Britain's Anglican aristocracy tended to support the Confederates and its evangelical churchmen, the Union. As American Puritanism won military victories and grew in power, its British counterparts advanced as well. Everyone loves a strong horse. Well, there's another thing to be said here too, right? Let's look at England, right? The most progressive, quote unquote, in the negative sense that Moldbug is talking about, is itself the Church of England. The most conservative parts of the British Isles, then and now, is Northern Ireland, where the Calvinists have ensconced themselves. So, again, what gives Moldbug? What gives? In the United States, right? Who are the most progressive denominations? Catholic Church, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, the Anglicans, all of these high church types. They're the ones that are the most woke on these issues. So it's just factually, statistically false what he's saying. And, it's just, we've already been here. I'm moving on. After World War II, American influence ensured that the entire country was more or less surrendered to the Labor Party, the political organ of the nonconformist tradition. The result is well described in Peter Hitchens' uber-reactionary but quite cogent Abolition of Britain, or somewhat more a politically enthused or Dalrymple's Life at the Bottom. New Labour is more or less a Cromwellian restoration, and one can only hope that its long-awaited comeuppance will be enlivened by the hanging of a corpse or two. I mean, this is just a nonsense word salad. I mean, New Labour. I mean, basically, Margaret Thatcher was asked what was her greatest impact on Britain. She said New Labour, because it basically adopted the talking points of individualism, consumerism, and the market that Reagan and Thatcher were pushing. And of course, Cromwell is completely not related to any modern political discourse, other than, for killing a king and putting England on the course that it's in now, where the king is a figurehead only. Oh, well, here we go. Professor Dawkins himself was raised as a high church Anglican. Okay, so what's all this crap about him being a nonconformist? He's literally raised as an Anglican. An animal now essentially extinct on planet 3. The present Archbishop of Canterbury is so low church it's surprising he can preach anywhere but an underground parking garage. If he were any lower church, he'd be in either hell or China, and as of late, the so-called Tories have undergone the same degrading humiliation. In the UK, any significant resistance to super-Protestantism is a footnote of history. The country's descent into sheer ecstatic barbarism, as foretold by the critics of nonconformist ascendancy, is now at hand. But the Church of England is still established. This is just a bunch of word salad. It doesn't mean anything. It's worth noting that before 1945, anti-Americanism in Europe was essentially a right-wing tradition, primarily opposed to the Yankee millenarianist democratism. As I have said, post-war anti-Americanism is an entirely different animal. which might be more accurately described as ultra-Americanism. It is a consequence of the projection of New Deal of American power, specifically of the New Deal, which represented the culminating triumph of the American progressive tradition, into a conquered Europe. These days, Europe has almost the same relationship to the U.S. as the U.S. in the days when it was the refuge of the dissenter mania bore to the U.K. Moving briefly to the continent, we encourage the strange phenomena of the so-called Enlightenment. Of course, everyone is enlightened by their own light, so this word tells us nothing. In my view, the Enlightenment and the similarly self-congratulatory Reformation are best understood as a continuum. But the former is notable because it constitutes the basal synapomorphy of non-theistic Christianity. I mean, again, this is patently absurd because remember, Richard Dawkins believes, guys, that the Bible, the Word of God, is the fundamental source of truth. This is insane. The Reformation said that truth was found in the Word of God. The Enlightenment said truth was found in man's reasoning capacities. This is ridiculous. Like I said, it's just ridiculous. But briefly, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes created a niche in France where it was more adaptive to be an unbeliever than a Protestant. The result was the rise of the philosophes and eventually the terrifying Rousseauian cult of reason, which should have been enough to make everyone swear off atheism forever. Surprisingly, it wasn't, and there is no better demonstration of the ties between English dissenters and French Jacobins, and thus of the connection between Puritanism and atheism than such figures as the Reverend Richard Price, whose pro-Jacobin sermon, Discourse on the Love of Country. Yeah, who is this Richard Price guy? Don't know. I mean, this is stupid. I mean, okay, where did we get the term social justice from? The Jesuits. So are we going to blame the Catholics for the Jesuits for social justice for progressives? I mean, that has more water than what Moldbug is saying. If we compare Price's sentiments with those of Reverend Harvey Cox, a modern exponent of secular theology, see The Secular City 25 years later, written exclusively 2 centuries after the discourse, the family resemblance is unmistakable. I can't think of a single point on which either of these reverends could raise his voice to the other. Puritanism and secularism are simply the same thing, which is simply BS. The existence of such modern sects as Unitarian Universalism demonstrate that there are zero thematic conflicts between the two. That is absolutely insane. Like, again, go back to the aughts, right? Who was leading the charge against secularism in America? It was religious right. And the religious right was broadly low church evangelical Protestants. And who was on the side of the progressives? All these hoity-toity high church types. Lutherans, Episcopalians, Anglicans, and a lot of Catholics. So, I mean, not to be fair, there were also Catholics on the religious right. So it's just such a big movement. There's going to be people on both sides. In UUism, the God theme is reduced to such irrelevance that congregants in the same church can simply agree to disagree on it, but you certainly won't find them disagreeing on the proposition that, say, all men are brothers. Well, okay, the other thing, too, this idea of a political reality in which all men are brothers, rather than some future eschaton, comes from the Catholic mystic Joachim of Fiora, 1135 to 1202. He came up with the 3 ages of the world. The Old Testament was the age of the Father. The age of the Son was the age of the New Testament, which was up to his own day. And then he claimed that, up to, I guess, 1206. And then after 1260. And after 1260, there'd be the age of the Holy Spirit, which would be the universal brotherhood of all mankind and the abolition of private property. Yeah, Jay Dyer talks about this guy, so he's one of the few modern people that will mention Joachim. And really, all of this stuff goes back to Joachim of Fiora as an actual idea. And then, of course, we have, after Joachim, we then have Thomas More's Utopia, which was one of the earliest communist tracts. Karol Katuski, the communist historian, viewed him as the first modern socialist. Lenin, when he erected a stela to the heroes of socialism, included him as well. So, I mean, there's literally no intellectual connection here. It's ridiculous. It's just Moldbug for you. Let's see. Of course, I've discussed this phenomenon before on UR. The label I prefer for the modern version of the Puritan tradition, Professor Dawkins' Einsteinianism, is Universalism. I hope I'm not boring people by continually harping on the subject. Well, you're boring me. But I'd like to take a few paragraphs to once again justify this terminology. One criticism of universalism is that this label is not used by any present-day Christian denomination to identify itself. I regard this as a virtue, not a vice. First, one of the main themes of universalism is that it does not self-classify as a Christian sect. Second, one notes that most Christian sects in the past would have wound up attached to labels which were originally composed by their enemies. This stands to reason. After all, these traditions are parasitic. One can expect them to be a little deceptive. Another criticism of the label universalism is that the word is derived from and easily confused with the simple English word universalism. Earlier, I tested some artificial labels which did not have this limitation, but after a while, they struck me as dorky. Wow, Moldbug. I mean, how much would you say is dorky? Like, I don't know why that's an objection. However, they mean the same thing, and you could use them if you like, if you don't mind sounding dorky. Suffice it to say that although Methodists are indeed often methodical, the Jurassic strata are indeed... Oh. Logos is here. Oh.
Hey, what's up? Got here as soon as I could.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, you didn't really miss a whole lot, Logos. The first part was him using biological classification to invent some schema to understand religion. A huge middle mess of not understanding theology or philosophy with his ultra-Calvinist BS.
Oh, he's back to that again, is he?
Yeah. The first part was a little interesting, but we're summing it up now. Let's see. Suffice to I did that. Are indeed exposed in the Jura, etc., etc. The fact that most universalists can indeed be described as universalists does not render these labels in any way, shape, or form equivalent or synonymous. As a term of technical theology, universalism also has a specific, although much disused meaning, the belief that everyone is saved and no one will go to hell.
How is that disused? That's the only time I've ever heard the word universalist used.
Well, not only that, that's the key element of his neo-Calvinism in the first place, that nobody goes to hell.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about that.
In his own definition.
Yeah, I missed that part, but sure as hell, nobody rarely uses that version of universalism. I'm in the Phil Riddle community on Twitter all the time, and everybody knows that's what universalism means. What is he talking about?
Well, I know. It's just stupid. Like, it's a word that already has a very specific theological meaning that Moldbug knows full well is in use. Fortunately, universalists, in my sense of the word, are certainly universalists in this sense. Well, there you go, right? There you go. They don't believe in hell, and they do believe that every human is essentially good.
Right.
Yeah, okay. So if it's much disused, but its use is baked into your use, how is it disused?
I have no idea what the hell he's talking about.
This guy is insane. He's like on acid or something. Michael S. wrote very eloquently about this correspondence here. Of course, if what you really mean is universalist in either the English sense above, rather than universalist as in a believer in universalism, the post-Puritan tradition, I can't ask you to mean something else. But here you are, the former is a confusing term, and if you feel the need to use it, please at least consider searching for a synonym. No, it's not confusing. If universalist means that everybody gets saved, how is that confusing, Logos?
I don't know. Like I said, maybe I missed something, but I have no idea how he's making this argument.
Whoops, guys. Hold on. I clicked out of something. Let me just bring it back up. There we go. All right. I don't know. Okay, how do we relate Einsteinian universalism? One easy approach is to look at Einstein himself. Einstein was an assimilated, non-observant Jew with a Reform background. Reform Judaism being essentially a Jewish version of Protestantism, in Israel, Reform is not really considered Jewish at all. A good summary of Einstein's belief is here. Note his affection for Quakerism, the Cromwellian uber Puritan sect part. Excellent. Okay, Logos. Even you know this is complete batshit insane. Quakerism is Cromwell. Done.
What? Quakers are pacifists.
I know.
Cromwell BTFO'd Parliament twice.
Yeah, I know. What?
What is he talking about?
This is just, see, along with many other things, this shows that Moldbug is just a bad actor. Like, everybody knows this is not true.
Right.
Why would you even say this?
Why would the people that listen to Moldbug have the patience for him saying this? They know better. They have to know better.
Oh, yeah. Wow. I have no, yeah. Oh, the other thing too, he was dropping Hume earlier, as if like Hume was good, and I'm like, well, how did Tradcat Thomas like this guy when he's like, rooted in Hume?
It's a good question. I don't know. Hume's
Remember, because according to the Tradcat's logos, everything bad in the world in philosophy comes from Hume's is ought gap and empiricism. So how does anything good come from Moldbug using Hume?
I don't know. I thought they always blamed it on who's that guy?
William of Ockham, nominalism.
Nominalism. Yeah. I thought that was.
But Hume does have a special place for these people too.
I guess that's true.
Because the claim Occam's errors are not epistemological; they're ontological.
Yep.
I have no qualms at all about describing Einstein as a universalist. It's also amusing to read Einstein's 1939 time capsule message to 6,939, whose entire text is, okay, our time is rich in inventive minds, the inventions of which could facilitate our lives considerably. We are crossing the seas by power and utilizing power also in order to relieve humanity from all tiring muscular work. We have learned to fly, and we're able to send messages and news without any difficulty over the entire world through electric waves. However, the production and distribution of commodities is entirely unorganized, so that everybody must live in fear of being eliminated from the economic cycle. In this way, suffering for the want of everything. Well, that's basically socialist, logos. How that's terrible. How could Einstein even say that?
Sounds kind of base to me. I don't know.
No, I know, but that's what Moldbug hates.
I love that last phrase, though. Suffering for the want of everything. I mean, that's basically what you talk about with like the rise of technique, technology, the ever-growing machine process. It's interesting.
Yeah. Furthermore, people living in different countries kill each other at regular time intervals, so that also, for this reason, anyone who thinks about the future must live in fear and terror. This is due to the fact that the intelligence and character of the masses are incomparably lower than the intelligence and character of the few who produce something valuable for the community. I trust that posterity will read these statements with a feeling of proud, justified superiority.
Wow. He had me in the first half, but the second, wow, that was a sharp turn. That could be like a PCM, political compass memes post right there. The first post he does is like either like green or red, like, lib left or off left. And that very second phrase, this is due to the intelligence and character of the masses are incomparably lower, blah, 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 blah. That's just like straight up like lib right or something. That was crazy. What?
Yeah. Yeah. Note the confession of faith in economic central planning, a common progressive belief. I feel quite confident that the residents of 6,959, whomever they may be, will read that one with a feeling of proud and justified superiority, if not quite in the way Einstein intended. If you are a universalist, I was certainly raised as a universalist, so I sympathize, and you are having trouble believing in the existence of this tradition, its Christian heritage, or its involvement with the American political system, please allow me to recommend some books. Try George Parker's Blood of Liberals, Anthony Lucas's Common Ground, Richard Ellis's Dark Side of the Left, Arthur Lippo's Authoritarian Socialism in America, Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate, Poison, Blank Slate, Poison logos.
Yep.
In Gordon Wood's Radicalism of the American Revolution. Again, why did Thomas like this guy logos? Blank Slate? Really?
Well, hold on. He's not actually recommending it. Look at the next sentence. He had me, but he got me in the next sentence.
Oh, what all these works have in common is that they were written by Orthodox Universalists, not conservatives. Oh, I see. And as such, they will not set off the massively hypertrophied M.41 alarm that comes with you with M.42 infection. The result will be a rather weird and eclectic picture of American Universalist history with many gigantic lacuna, but it ought to at least get you started. Yeah, okay. Let me step back and take one last look at the entire phenomenon. Again, I am arguing that the Enlightenment is not orthogonal to the Reformation, but that secularism is best considered as a form of Protestantism. I mean, this is the stupidest thing I ever heard, Logos. Well, what was the basic premise of the Reformation? That the Word of God alone was sufficient for faith. What's the central teaching of the Enlightenment? That man, through his reason, can understand the world. How are those two the same thing?
If I had to reach and be maximally charitable here, basically, the question is who interprets the Word of God. Under Catholic teaching, there's a centralized church authority, kind of like Moldbug's cameralism, which is why he seems to have the soft spot for Catholics, that tells you how it is when you read the Word of God. What Moldbug seems to be taking umbrage with here, Protestantism, is that people can kind of interpret the Word of God for themselves, or in their own small church communities, or whatever. And that's what he's seeing here. He's just seeing the Protestant Catholic divide here more as an undermining of central authority versus decentralized authority.
Right, but okay, my two favorite examples, right? Let's look at the British Isles themselves. What is the most conservative, reactionary, right-wing part of the British Isles? Northern Ireland, and that's held by the Calvinists. The Church of England is entirely gone from Moldbug's point of view, and frankly, Pope Francis wasn't Pope at the time, but I don't think Moldbug would be a fan of Pope Francis right now either. So all of
it's
this
not about the politics. It's literally just about bowing to centralized authority. That's all he cares about.
But it's okay, but why? So that you can stop the progressive disease. But it works the other way around. These centers of power get corrupted because they don't want to lose their power, so they bow to progressivism.
True, but I don't think Moldbug cares. Remember, Moldbug doesn't care about any oughts about who ought to be in charge, what people in power ought to do. All he cares about is that everybody bends the knee and knows who's in charge. So if the Catholic Church gets subverted by progressives, but everybody still bends the knee to them and knows they're in charge, he is perfectly okay with that.
Then, yeah, okay, Moldbug is okay with progressivism. But you see, is he really okay with progressivism, though? I mean, I guess he is, because as of his coming back in 2020,
he has to be.
He has to be, because he's now really going hard to defend them.
I mean, he has to be. Again, essay 1. You can't have any political oughts about who to be in charge. So if progressives win the cameralist fight, and everybody knows they're in charge, and everybody knows they've been in the progressives to lower the political violence, then there it is. We're progressives now.
Right. Okay. Moreover, though this is a separate discussion, the modern battlefield between left and right displays clear continuity with Protestant Catholic conflict. Yeah, where the Protestants are almost always on the political right. United States, Great Britain. Like, what is he talking about? Because he's going to flip it. As an extremely rough approximation, when we factor out the God theme, what we see is that leftism is Protestantism and rightism is Catholicism. That's just completely ass backwards.
Yeah.
You did a study in 2014. These are like Pentecostals too. These are like converts from Catholicism to Pentecostalism, and they're like 20 to 30 points more conservative on a whole host of social issues than their Catholic peers. And in the United States, the Catholic Church, the Catholic lay people are in favor of gay marriage at only a slightly smaller margin than liberal mainline Protestants. What is he smoking?
He's using his personal definition of leftism and rightism, where rightism is just centralized authority no matter what, and leftism is centralized authority only on our terms.
Right. Well, that seems to be the only way to make sense of this, so I'll have to go with you on it. One of the reasons this generalization is so rough is you find counterexamples such as modern Northern Ireland, in which the Catholics are clearly left and the Protestants are right, is that Catholicism and Protestantism are themselves extremely vague terms. Ultramontanism and liberation theology are both nominally Catholic, although I would certainly describe the latter as Protestantizing low church. How is communism which is what liberation theology is, low church Protestantism?
I don't know enough about it. The only thing I could see him maybe saying is that it's a revolutionary offshoot of Catholicism that wasn't maybe ordained by the Pope or something. So it's kind of like it's it's kind of like a cancer in the Catholic Church that started in these certain churches and it's just kind of like been spreading. It's basically the only way he could see it.
Well, look, I mean, this all starts with Thomas More's Utopia.
Yeah.
And like, okay, like this is, and I'm not, look, the communists themselves admit More is the guy that started what they're finishing.
Right.
Now a Catholic might say, well, that's misreading Thomas More. Well, in one hand, that's irrelevant because that's how the communists are using Thomas More.
Exactly. Yep.
So, for example, there was a Catholic apologist who wrote a book called, I think it was around 2007, called the Protestant Reformation and the Unplanned Revolution. Like, he's like, well, they didn't plan to upend the social order, but it doesn't matter. That's what they did. That was his entire argument. And I'm like, okay, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Thomas More maybe didn't intend this, but that's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Jansenism is another historical example of Protestantized Catholicism, which competed with the Philosophes for the niche left open by the expulsion of the Huguenots. Again, this is idiotic. Jansenism was a sect within Catholicism in the 17th century France, which took a very Augustinian view of predestination. Very, very hard line. But because it was so close to Calvinism and the Reformation was so recent, they didn't get a lot of truck from the church hierarchy. But what they were doing was using what Augustine gave them. Again, Moldbug has no idea about the history of ideas or religion. It's sand. It's just noise. And the adaptive radiation of the Protestant clade needs no comment. Homoplaces and introgressions are legion in this gigantic bag of worms. You know, for all this talk about being adaptive, he never actually describes how these beliefs are adaptive. You ever notice that, Logos?
I thought maybe I missed something because we were talking about his critique of Dawkins, right?
Yes.
And that's where he was getting into the whole adaptation and memes and stuff like that. Like he was setting up his framework the first one, and then I missed stuff at the beginning of this one. Sorry again about that. Did he go over anything about adaptation here?
Okay, bag of worms. We'll come back to you. Yeah, there's a few things. Let's see. Well, this is kind of important. Morbidity. He says that there are two kinds of morbidity. One that compromise personal goals. So that'd be like, praxeology, which he calls Misesian morbidity. And there's what he calls the Darwinian morbidity, which compromises the host's ability to reproduce. Clearly nothing about the modern progressive system is Darwinian, it's all Darwinian morbidity. Nobody's reproducing.
That's true. And also
which is maladaptive.
Yeah.
According to Moldbug.
That's true. And also it's not even, well, it's the problem is it doesn't even seem to be maladaptive in a Misesian sense, because people who are in favor of the system have certain goals that they're using the system to push in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, not only that, he keeps on arguing that religion is morbid, but like the only people reproducing are Christians in the West,
right?
So clearly, it's not morbid in the Darwinian sense.
He's just trying to make like some neo-Nietzschean argument. It sounds like
this is where, like, quote unquote, the adaptability or at least harmful aspects come up.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole classification schema he gives. But okay, worms. Back to the worms. Here we go. Okay. One way to produce a better generalization is to see that this same conflict is not a competition between two clades, but between two adaptive niches. We can describe these niches very abstractly as Pietists and liturgists. Pietist traditions in Christianity are abstract, ascetic, monastic, philosophical, and democratic. Bro, Logos, where do the monks come from? Pop quiz. Where do they come from, Logos?
Catholicism?
Yes.
Yeah.
What is he talking? Ascetic. What is he talking about?
I don't know.
I mean, go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Well, the democratic thing's also a puzzle too. I mean, it's not clear that monks are engaging in democratic government or anything. As far as I know, their monasteries are still under the whole cardinal,
Mhm.
bishop, whatever structure. What's democratic about these monks?
Well, no. He's saying that he's coining two labels here: pietist and liturgist.
Right?
He's saying that pietist, which he's going to clearly identify with Protestantism, includes asceticism, monasticism, that's insane. That's not
Yeah,
a
it
part of
sounds like
Protestant.
Catholic monks. It doesn't sound like Protestants.
I
But
know.
Catholic monks aren't very democratic. So I'm wondering who he's talking about.
Well, yeah, I think we all are. Liturgist traditions are ritualist, charismatic. Bro, charismaticism is in the Protestants with the Pentecostals.
Pentecostals, yeah.
What are you talking about?
I mean, if there was a charismatic axis to any religious sect, these people break the scouter. They break the scouter.
Yeah, Moldbug is just this blender of nonsense, just vomiting it up everywhere. It's like somebody's put everything in the blender and took the lid off, and it's just flying all over the room, all over the kitchen. Materialistic, doctrinal, and hierarchical. Strains of Christianity go way back, well before the Reformation, can be described as occupying the pietist or liturgist niche, often shifting between them. With this adaptive taxonomy, atheism, secularism, laicism, etc., appear as an extreme variance of pietism. Whoa! So new atheism logos was ascetic and monastic? What?
It was what?
Well, that's what he's saying. He says, with this adaptive taxonomy, atheism, secularism, laicism appear as extreme variants of pietism. That's nonsense.
That's nonsense. It's charismatic. Insane. It's charismatic, first of all. It's definitely materialistic.
It's hierarchical. The university,
Trust the science. Yep. Definitely hierarchical.
This
definitely
is clearly
doctrinal.
It's clearly a liturgist tradition by his own statement.
Yeah. The only thing it's weak in is rituals, because the atheists have a point. There's no one way to be an atheist, but it's very, very high in the other ones. It can't be any higher.
There are rituals. There's the deconversion story. Then there's flipping off mom and dad. Then there's going around yelling at Christians on the internet. There's a whole ritual involved in becoming a new atheist.
I don't know about that one, but we'll move on.
The urge to tear down all ritual, to worship reason in man rather than church and God, to whitewash the frescoes and melt down the candlesticks is ever present in pietism. Wait. So, pietists worship reason in man? What?
Yeah, I have no idea what they're talking about.
Professor Dawkins' entire shtick is perfectly consistent with this pietist niche. No wonder it's so successful. Now, this is literally idiotic. By his own definition, Dawkins is a liturgist.
He's definitely a liturgist.
By the definition that Moldbug gave us.
Yeah.
Whereas the fundamentalist American born-again Christians whom Professor Dawkins so loathes and so longs to outlaw, is if they weren't already quite thoroughly expelled from the official education system, not to mention utterly eradicated in Europe, have developed a faith that through its cladistic origins are thoroughly Protestant, is clearly settling into the liturgist niche. Whoa. So, American evangelicalism, okay, maybe, with the mega churches, you have the top-down control from the super pastors. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Now,
one thing that makes this dynamic really, really interesting, why it's definitely more doctrinal. Think about the different new atheist responses to that whole thing. There's like that talk in South Africa where that student was like, well, can your science explain how our shaman can call the lightning or whatever? Like, that was a big deal in, what was it, 2017 when that happened? 2016, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
The new atheists were horrified about this. The last thing they want is science to be, quote, democratized so that these people have some equal say.
Oh, they don't want that at all.
They don't want that at all. Like, the democratization of science in the face of things like that. Look at Sam Harris. Sam Harris, one of the cornerstone new atheists. He's one of the four horsemen. Mm-hmm. He is apoplectic. because he can't see why people still support, like, say, Trump or whatever, and they're not using their science, they're not using their rational faculties or whatever. We have to shut them down for their own good. He is absolutely anti-populist, anti-democratic. Like, we can see that now. You could see it back then with the way they like talk down to people about, like, evolution and cosmology, whatever. You don't understand this well enough. This is insane.
The entire new atheist movement is liturgist by his own definition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, he should be happy with these people. They're doing what they want, what he wants them to do.
Yeah, if you want to see a doctrinal atheist movement, you have to look at the new social justice variant of atheism. That would be doctrinal by his, or not doctrinal. Pietist by his own definition.
Let's see. No, they're not ascetic or monastic.
They're social justice types?
Yeah.
That's true. But nobody is. Nobody is.
Nobody is. What
nobody
is
it? But
today, nobody is.
They are philosophical as opposed to scientific, and they are democratic as opposed to doctrinal. That's a big thing. Their entire point is standpoint epistemology. Everybody has unique ways of knowing, which is definitely a democratic thing. And they are definitely more of a, let's analyze the power structures that determine scientific thinking rather than the science itself. They're very philosophy over science. It's almost like if pragmatism like took a shot of cocaine or something and just like went to town, that would be like their epistemology vis-a-vis science.
Okay, indeed, Professor Dawkins seems to feel exactly the same way about those awful people that his dissenter forebears felt about the scheming papists. See, this is idiotic, right? Because he even admits in this article that Dawkins himself was raised in a high church Anglican background. So how can his ancestors be dissenters?
That's a good question.
For literally centuries, fear of the Romish menace animated Protestant faithful on both sides of the pond. The fact that any serious possibility of an Anglo-Catholic restoration ended in 1746 was hardly a check on this rich, ever-flowering wellspring of demagogic paranoia. The Culture Conf in Germany and the Dreyfus Affair in France note that just because the anti-Dreyfusards were wrong about Dreyfus doesn't mean they were wrong about everything. Our other more recent outbreaks of the liturgists' Pietist war, which Professor Dawkins seems eager to resurrect. Essentially, Professor Dawkins and his fellow new atheists have planted the seed of a political movement which might well be described as neo-anti-clericalism. No, it's not. They're the clerics. Yep. What are you talking about? They're the clerics with the white lab coats. Listen to us. Magic Science Man.
Yeah, it was basically a schism between two clerical classes.
Yes.
The anti-clerical class would basically be the populist movement that we're seeing come up, especially post-COVID. That's an anti-clerical movement.
Yes. I'd like to think that, and which by the way, Moldbug does not like at all.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Moldbug's probably closer to Sam Harris's side of the whole thing, if we're being honest.
Yeah. I'd like to think that if they took a closer look at the past fruits of this particular vegetable, they might think twice and decide to backpedal with a quick dose of Roundup. I believe that at this point I've adequately demonstrated claim 2. If you're not convinced, I really have no idea what I could say to you to convince you further. As for claim 3, the claim that Universalism is the most successful Christian tradition today, that strikes me as simply obvious. Well, I mean, if you just choose to make up a new definition for Universalism that no one actually uses except you, some confusion may be afforded by the definition of success, by which I mean, of course, Darwinian, that is reproductive success. The fact that most of the influential repeaters of the Western world, the universities, state schools, and official press, are by any standard universalist organs is quite sufficient to demonstrate claim 3. It is also worth noting that Universalism is far, far more fashionable, that it's simply cooler than any of its competitors to find social situations in which it's a faux pas to express universal sentiments. You have to dig very deep on the fashion scale, clearly well into Walmart or Yobo territory in the U.S. and Britain, respectively. The converse is not exactly the case. Explaining that George W. Bush, who is at least nominally a salvationist, though the veneer is pretty thin and pretty transparent, I have to say, is the president of the most powerful country on earth is not going to convince me that your anti-salvationist fears are justified. First, you might want to take a look at the actual power of the United States U.S. president and the achievement of the far more dedicated, powerful, and popular salvationist Ronald Reagan, and rolling back universalism and promoting salvationism. Does the word not mean anything to you? I mean, he did. I think he gave us a definition of salvationism many moons ago, but I don't remember what it was. Second, the reason the U.S. has a president who is at least nominally salvationist is simply that a number of diehard salvationists and the number of fanatical universalists in the United States is roughly equal. Considering the fact that the latter control essentially all institutions by which traditions are instilled in the young, not to mention the fact that universalists are importing new voters like it was going out of style. Hey, so if he knew this in 2007, Logos, why is he telling the hobbits to rest on their bums?
I have no idea. Well, because he's a bad actor. We know this.
We can expect the balance of power to shift towards universalism. So, Logos, just sit on your backside and do nothing while the balance of power shifts towards universalism.
Yep. There you go. It'd almost be funny to send this article to the guy who wrote the response to the Elves vs. Hobbits thing and saying, yeah, Moldbug knew about your response way back when. You know, he's not being honest here.
Which is pretty much what it's been doing for the last 150 years. Well, you know what's funny, right, Logos? This is where like base Marx comes in because, you know, in the Communist Manifesto, he talks about all these immigrants being brought in by capital.
Yep.
And okay, so then, okay, again, back to what Moldbug's hiding. Okay, we all know it's big capital that's the problem because they're the ones bringing in these people, these new voters. But he cannot bring himself to say that.
Right, and he could be forgiven for not knowing it in 2007 to some degree, although there are plenty of like left-wing sources and stuff talking about this. But now we know for certain. Like, remember when COVID first came out and Trump's like, yeah, we're gonna use COVID as an excuse to shut the borders down. And then Kushner's just like, yeah, talk to Apple, and they say you're not gonna do that. The next day, Trump's like, yeah, I'm not gonna do that. Like, we know we know why this is being done. Hint, it's not the universities.
It's so stupid to tilt at that windmill. Where, for instance, is Anita Bryant today? What mainstream Republican even dares to oppose affirmative action? Where are even the pro-lifers? You couldn't get 5% of the vote in the U.S. now. Well, Logos, the pro-lifers rolled back Roe v. Wade, and you're really freaking butthurt about it.
Yep.
Like, you couldn't get 5% of the vote in the U.S. now for the bedrock shibboleth of the 1970s salvationist reaction. I'm certainly not a salvationist. Au contraire, I'm a hardcore, deep-fried atheist. And my connection with middle American culture is not much stronger than that of Pauline Kael, who famously didn't know anyone who voted for Nixon. I would certainly not enjoy living in America, which was dominated by salvationists, if we define dominance as the sort of power universalism enjoys today. But this possibility strikes me as remote as to the point of absurdity, and quite frankly, I refuse to let myself be led around by the nose by knee-jerk reactions of fear and hate. Selah. If you're not convinced on 3, again, this is a little more than I can say. Perhaps you should try washing your eyes out with a little soapy water. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of hot garbage in this article, and much of it we've already covered before in other articles. The one thing that I will give Moldbug here is he's one of the only new atheists that saw the religious right was already dead and that the religious right was not going to have an insurgency. Now, how he saw it and no one else did, I will give that to Moldbug. Anything you want to say, Logos?
No, I think you said it.
I mean, give the devil his due. He was right on that one.
Yep.
All right. How Dawkins got pwned, chapter 3. Minutu and the Zeitgeist. Oh boy. Having made a case that there is such a thing as universalism, there is a non-theistic Christian tradition, and that the distinction between theist and non-theistic traditions is not terribly significant. See also Eric Hoffer, who said much the same thing in The True Believer. It seems reasonable to take a fresh look at the effects of universalism on present-day society and to decide in which ways its effects can be described as positive or negative. Okay, one other point I'm going to make that I will give Moldbug from How Dawkins Got Pwned is this. His entire point that the modern secular zeitgeist, the new atheists inhabited, had a lot of really bad, dangerous ideas, just as dangerous to the scientific method as what they considered radical theology, radical fundamentalists. In light of the woke, is absolutely correct.
Yep.
So again, I'll give that to Moldbug. This is considered one of his better works, and there's still a lot of hot garbage in it, but those 2 points he gets. We should certainly expect to find positive effects of universalism, if nothing else. Any decent mimetic parasite has the trivial positive effect of interfering with, undercutting, and generally destroying any potential competitors. For example, one cannot simultaneously be an Aztec and a Catholic, or at least not a good Aztec and a good Catholic. G.K. Chesterton had a handle on the trivial positive effect when he noted that when people try to believe in nothing, they often wind up believing in anything. Universalists think that they believe in nothing. In reality, they believe in universalism. And this has the trivial positive effect of keeping them from worshiping anything else, such as Paul, Hitler, or Manchester United. Like clean water, fresh air, or a good selection of ethnic restaurants, the trivial positive effect is easy to forget until you find yourself without it. There are probably other positive effects of universalism, and we should probably note them when we stumble over them, if only to be fair. However, hiding its light under a bushel is not exactly universalism style. Why would it be? So let's accentuate the negative. In describing the negative effects of universalism, we're looking for three basic criteria. First, we want to show that the theme is irrational, that is, alien to reason. Second, we want to show that it is adaptive, that it helps universalism in itself propagate. Third, we want to show that it is morbid, that it makes bad stuff happen. So real quick, just for your benefit, Logos, irrational means he gave the example like something can't both be true and false at the same time about a given object.
Right.
Yeah. So that's fairly straightforward. Morbidity just means badness. Badness is always in the eye of the beholder. However, an easy way to escape this problem of Hume's ought is to use the standard of universalism itself. This gets a little tricky when universalism contradicts itself, but we'll deal. Recall also that by the standards of universalism itself, any irrationality is trivially morbid. But I'm afraid we may turn up some less trivial morbidities. If we find no irrational, adaptive, morbid themes, we can conclude that universalism is not a parasitic tradition at all. It is actually a symbiotic tradition. I don't think there are any historical examples of a perfectly symbiotic tradition, but perhaps universalism is simply the first. It certainly claims to be the first. We also like to understand the ancestry of the themes, blah, blah, blah. As several commentators point out, explaining, for example, that some theme originated in 17th century England among some group of people now generally considered whack jobs does not show that it's irrational or morbid, but it may help us to understand why the theme is so successful, and it often helps to start with ancestry because it creates a nice narrative flow. Let's start with what might well be universalism's central belief, the principle of fraternism. Fraternism is a belief that all men and women are created and born equal. And as my jocular overstrikes indicate, the ancestry of fraternalism ain't exactly no voyage manuscript. Universalism is generally Pietist strain of Protestant Christianity. Pietism de-emphasizes ritual and authority in God in favor of devotion, equality in man. Universalism could be summarized, especially as the worship of humanity, and the New Testament is positively strewn with fraternalist doxology. I'll go with Occam on this one. Oh, so he's an Occamite. Like Logos, how does this happen?
I don't know, man.
And I mean, this is just frankly idiotic. All I'll say to this is, in his Passing of the Great Race, the alt-right, he wrote this before the alt-right, this progressive racialist thinker in America, was it Passing of the Great Race? Madison Grant pointed out that of the two branches of Western Christendom that support universal brotherhood, it's the Catholics. And it's the Protestants that have the race laws, like in the American South or South Africa. And so it's just, again, false. And, I think Moldbug has to know this. But, reasons. From a theological perspective, there's an easy way to see why all men and women are born equal. It's because they all have souls, and a soul is a soul. There's no such thing as a big soul, a little soul, a yellow soul, a green soul, or a white soul. In fact, to a modern universalist, there's not even such a thing as a bad soul. All dogs go to heaven. Well, no, that's stupid. The only, because again, we know that it's racists. Those are the guys that go to hell, right?
Yep.
It's racist. All dogs. Go ahead.
So there is a way where that can make sense. They think that what they want to do with racists ultimately isn't send them to hell. They want to send them to a what do they call a re-education camp. They think that if you manipulate the social factors, you can cure racism by curing the racists of the social things that make them racist.
Yeah, I know. That's But like the liberal Christians that I've known, the only people that go to hell are racists. It's ridiculous. All dogs go to heaven and all souls are good. If there's anyone we have to think for this, it's Emerson. If a person does bad things, it's not that his or her soul is bad, but that it is in some way wounded, untaught, or misguided. I mean, Plato kind of even says that, right, Logos?
Say that again. What does Plato say?
That if the person does bad things, it's not that his or her soul is bad, but that it is in some way wounded, untaught, or misguided.
Yeah, that's really interesting because Plato's model, at least one of his models, the Phaedo had a bunch of different models, but the body as a prison model would say that like it's the vices of the body that kind of tug on the soul and get it to do a bunch of crazy things. But it's also weird because the soul can become bad if it gives in, and the soul kind of becomes what it does in some weird respect. So it's interesting.
Well, also too, the idea of political equality, because he's talking about political equality here. I don't look. You can argue it comes from the soul, but I just don't think that sticks because the Enlightenment thinkers who talked about political equality don't mention the soul. In fact, the father of social contract, Hobbes, points to the fact that any man can kill any other man in his sleep. That's where political equality comes from.
Yes. And then even if you want to go the only weird twisted way you could get it is if you said, well, souls are basically the same as minds, and then you go to like the tabula rasa route and say that, well, we're all born blank slates or something.
Right. But this is what I get tired of. You see this so often in the right. It's like, well, political equality comes from the soul. No, it doesn't. Hume doesn't mention the soul. I don't think Locke mentions the soul, at least not to make the case for political equality.
Only if soul's equivalent to mind, which in my mind seems to be kind of like a modern device, right? It seems to be like the dualistic view of the mind brain. Mind is linked with the soul. I mean, you've talked about that. You think there are some differences between the mind and the soul. Certainly from a classical perspective, you'd say there are. Soul is like the animus, mind is like the driver, something like that. So you only get this weird tabula rasa talking about the soul view is if you think they're the same thing.
Right. Of course, Universalism does not use the word soul. Instead, it deploys the word human. This word human in Universalism is what I call a cult word. Its emotional associations are so strong that it's simply impossible to reason around. God is, of course, a cult word to a theist, and in its own way to an atheist, which is why I prefer non-theist. If I were writing Professor Dawkins' book, and I actually wanted to convince believers rather than just whipping the choir into a mouth-foaming orgy of hate, I might start by changing the word. One might say, assuming that God is the same thing as Manituo, does Manituo exist? If your reader is unwilling to accept a mere change of labels, he or she is beyond reason. Otherwise, the discussion has freed itself from unproductive emotional reflexes. I mean, he hasn't really done anything. Like, what does he think he's done?
I have no idea.
Trying to figure out what Moldbug thinks he has done has pretty much been the question du jour this whole time. Similarly, we can avoid the word human by deploying the precise Leninian term hominid, or it should be precise anyway. The paleontologists seem to change its meaning every 5 minutes. As per Lewicki, the current proper term for bipedal ape is homininian, which at the same time of this writing gets less than 1,000 Google hits. People, are you trying to confuse us? Until you get your story straight, I'll stick with hominid as anything in the genus Homo. In the fossil record, if the fossil record is to believe, and who knows, maybe all these bones date to 4004 BC when Manituo instantiated the universe, the past contained quite a few types of hominid whose like is no longer to be found, which I have to say is a pity. Perhaps they would have made good pets. However, we can refer to the set of hominids now living on planet 3 as neo-humanoids. Hominids. A human is a neo-hominid with a soul, but since all neo-hominids have souls, the qualification is redundant, so we can restate universal fraternalism. All neo-hominids are born equal. Now let's evaluate this proposition. First, per the doxology from chapter 2, we need to describe whether it is factual, ethical, or metaphysical. Is it a description of reality? Does it describe moral variance to some action? Or is it just a sticky lump of linguistic ambergris? Well, again, let's go back to Hobbes. Hobbes is describing a physical reality. A strong man can be killed by a weak man if the strong man is asleep.
Or poisoned, or ganged up on.
Yes. But as far as the actual equality point being made, he mentions killing them in his sleep. Where, yeah. I think most universalists consider fraternalism factual. Some might say it's also ethical, but I think it's more accurate to say that universalists consider it unethical to act on or propagate afraternism, disbelief in fraternism. If fraternism is true, afraternism is false, and since it's unethical to act on or propagate a lie, the factual case covers this. So fraternism is a factual claim. Next, we need to consider what this sentence is actually saying. We get neo-hominids, we get born. But what about the word equal? An alien might well assume it means identical. So, for example, all black 2007 Hyundai Civic DXs are created equal. There may be some minor assembly differences, but we should not expect these differences to matter, at least to whoever is buying the vehicle. And we would need to expect to see any detectable patterns of difference, except, of course, for opinion package, etc. And neo-hominids don't have option packages, though it would be certainly cool if they did. However, we notice various differences between newborn neo-hominids, such as the shape of the nose, the texture of the hair, the color of the poop, etc. Wow, Moldbug. He's just batting 1 out of 1,000, isn't he, Logos?
Yep.
So identical is not an option. We are left with the conclusion that cogent differences between neo-hominids are in some sense unimportant. For example, perhaps the differences do not affect the neo-hominid's ability to succeed at various tasks of economic significance. While this was not true in the past, in the world of 2007, most of the neo-hominid's economic productivity is the result of its central nervous system. Of course, the CNS of a newborn neo-hominid is not only unproductive, but downright annoying. What we mean is obviously its potential for development, and we can also disregard disease or otherwise malformed individuals. So, without, I think, much loss of information, we can state fraternism as the proposition that all healthy neo-hominids are born with equal potential for neurological development. Is this proposition rational or irrational? Whichever it is, Professor Dawkins clearly buys it. He writes, Thomas Henry Huxley, by the standards of his time, was an enlightened and liberal progressive, but his times were not ours. In 1971, he wrote the following: no rational man, cognizant of the facts, believes that the average Negro is the equal, still less the superior of the white man. And if this be true, it is simply incredible that when all his disabilities are removed, our prognathous relative has a fair field and no favor, as well as no oppressor, he will be able to compete successfully with his bigger brain and smaller jawed rival, in contest which is to be carried out by thoughts and not by bites. The highest place in the hierarchy of civilization will assuredly not be within the reach of our dusky cousins. It is a commonplace that good historians don't judge statements from past times by the standards of their own. Had Huxley been born and educated in our time, he would have been the first to cringe with us at his Victorian sentiments and unctuous tone. I quote them only to illustrate how the Zeitgeist moves on. I don't know, Woody Logos? There's plenty of people today that would agree with Huxley right now online.
Uh-huh.
So, Dawkins is so full of himself. He's so full of crap. This is hard, Logos. Like, do I get mad at Dawkins or do I get mad at Moldbug? I have
Why not both?
Yeah, I know. Why not both? What exactly is this Zeitgeist thing? Is it anything like Manitou? Well, return to this fascinating question. In any case, had Professor Huxley been born and educated in North Korea, he would have been the first to praise the dear leader. Had he been born and educated in 4th century Byzantium, he would have been the first to perform the proskynesis before the Emperor Constantine. Had my aunt had any balls, she'd be my uncle. And had Professor Huxley himself been extracted from 1871, perhaps the Zeitgeist has some kind of supplemental time travel feature. He might want to know why Professor Dawkins disagrees so confidently, so dare I say, unctuously with him. This arrogant, bewhiskering troglodyte, still damp with the ichor of the 12th dimension, might even dare to demand some actual evidence. Obviously, it would be easy for us to satisfy Professor Huxley. Once he saw that one of the 5 Americans drives a Haitian car, that the last 2 winners of the Nobel Prize for Christianity hailed from Papua New Guinea, and that Japan has trouble exporting anything it can trade for Mozambican semiconductors, I'm sure he'll sing a different tune. As Thomas Friedman once put it, back when we had something to say, a Swiss soldier stole my Syrian watch. In all seriousness, what is the evidence for fraternism? Why exactly does Professor Dawkins believe that all neo-hominids are born with identical potential for neurological development? He doesn't say. Perhaps he thinks it's obvious. Perhaps, if anything, like Cosma Shalizi, and Professor Shalizi is, if anything, even smarter than Professor Dawkins, he believes that there is no convincing evidence that all neo-hominids are not born with identical potential for neurological development. Similarly, another very smart person, Aaron Schwartz, sees no convincing evidence that neo-hominid males and females are not neurologically identical. Well, I think this is one area where we can see why the dissident right liked the Moldbug. He's sort of pioneering these sort of IQ arguments.
Yep.
Of course, Dawkins has no convincing evidence that Manitou does not exist. Oh, isn't that fascinating? Don't you just love these double negatives? What we have here is a factual proposition which has swept to dominance, not through the presentation of any evidence, but by a simple trick of reassigning the burden of proof to rest solely on those who doubt it. Okay, that's actually 100% correct. When I was in college, I got so frustrated having to fight these ideas that were just coming down from on high as like, oh, they're just self-evident. Like, no, they're not. It's like, don't question them. It is not the fraternists who have to demonstrate that fraternism is true. It is the afraternists who have to demonstrate that it's false. So, if I were to claim that the neo-hominid male liver is functionally indistinguishable from the neo-hominid female liver, that there is no sexual dimorphism in the neo-hominid liver, I'd expect someone to ask me why I was justified in making this claim. I would not expect them to accept the response that I see no convincing evidence that my claim is untrue. And this is despite the fact that the liver is not directly involved in the neo-hominid reproductive cycle. When we replace liver with brain, we have considerably longer row to hoe, yet somehow the Zeitgeist shows up and hoes it overnight. If only it would do the same for my laundry. If you're actually interested in a positive empirical case for afraternism, let me recommend Thomas and Gray 2004. And it's worth noting that afraternism is Steven Pinker's dangerous idea. Michael Hart's Understanding Human History has to be the worst job of a book designed in human history, and my general reaction is that Hart understands neo-hominids a heck of a lot better than he understands history. However, all the cool kids are reading it. But my concern is not empirical, it is philosophical and historical. What I am interested in is how and why it came to be the case that fraternism is assumed true until proven false, and afraternism is assumed false until proven true. One simple answer is that since we are assuming universalist ethics, fraternism is the ideal state of the world. My ethics are basically universalist, and if I had a blue button I could push to institute fraternism, regardless of the actual present state of reality, I'd push it. And I'd feel good about pushing it. If I had an opposite red button, I wouldn't push it. And if I accidentally push it anyway, I'd feel really, really bad. I mean, it's hard to tell if he's joking around or being serious, because he's mentioned enough times he's a Brahmin, he's a part of the elite establishment. So I don't know. Is this a joke, Logos, or for real?
Which part exactly?
This whole paragraph.
I don't think he's joking.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Thus, we could say that fraternism is optimistic and afraternism is pessimistic, but it is rational to assert that optimistic propositions should be assumed true until proven false. And pessimistic propositions should be assumed false until proven true, not in the slightest. We are back at square one. One could also suggest a technical explanation, which might go like this. Since there is no reproductive isolation between any two neo-hominid populations, we should expect these populations to be genetically homogeneous. Anyone who wants to make a case for any kind of genetic inhomogeneity, therefore, should have to make it. Perhaps Lawrenson's fallacy could be a drug into the picture as well, just for color. However, as we can see by outwardly visible traits such as nose shape, hair texture, etc., the antecedent is false. It is possible that disparities in visible traits are the result of genetic drift. It is also possible that they the result of natural selection. But it doesn't matter which, because an evolutionary process that can vary a visible feature can vary an invisible one. We've recently learned that neo-hominid populations show substantial evidence of recent selection, much more recent than the divergence of continental gene pools. But even before we knew this, we had no biological reason to assign fraternism the benefit of the doubt. Clearly, fraternism did not get the benefit of the doubt in 1871, so at some point it must have changed. How, when, and why? Perhaps Charles Francis Adams Jr. can enlighten us on the subject. As the great-grandson and grandson of Federalist and Whig president, son of an aide to one of the North's leading abolitionist statesmen and a Union general himself, one might expect he had some opinions on the matter, and one would be right from a 1913 speech. Beyond all this, and coming still under the head of individual theories, was the doctrine enunciated by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. The doctrine that all men were created equal, meaning, of course, equal before the law. But the theorist and humanitarian of the North, accepting the fundamental principle laid down in the Declaration, gave it a far wider application than had been intended by its authors, a breadth of application it would not bear. Such science as had been of a scriptural origin. He interpreted the word equal as signifying equal in the possibilities of their attributes, physical, moral, intellectual, and in so doing, he, of course, ignored the first principles of ethnology. It was, I now realize, a somewhat wild-eyed school of philosophy, that of which I myself was a youthful disciple. So far, then, as the institution of slavery is concerned, its relations to ownership and property and those of the human species, I see no reason whatever to revise or in any way to alter the theories and principles I entertained in 1853, and in the maintenance of which I subsequently bore arms through 1861 and 1865. Economically, socially, and from the point of view of abstract political justice, I hold that the institution of slavery as it existed in this country prior to the year 1865 was in no respect either desirable or justifiable. That it had its good and even its ever-elevating side so far, at least as the African is concerned, I am not here to deny. On the contrary, I see and recognize these features of the institution far more now than I would have said would have been possible in 1853. That the institution in itself, under conditions then existing, tended to the elevation of the less advanced race, I frankly admit I did not then think. On the other hand, that it exercised a most pernicious influence upon those of the more advanced race, and especially upon that large majority of the more advanced race who were not themselves owners of slaves, of that I have become with time ever more and more satisfied. The noticeable feature, however, so far as I individually am concerned, has been the entire change of views as respects certain of the fundamental propositions at the base of our whole American political and social edifice, brought about by a more careful and intelligent ethnological study. I refer to the political equality of man, and to that race absorption to which I have alluded, that belief that any foreign element introduced into the American social system and body politic would speedily be absorbed therein, and in a brief space thoroughly assimilated. In this all-important respect, I do not hesitate to say we theorists and abstractionists of the North, throughout that long anti-slavery discussion, which ended with 1861 clash of arms, were thoroughly wrong, in utter disregard of fundamental scientific facts. We theoretically believed that all men, no matter what might be the color of their skin or the texture of their hair, were, if placed under exactly similar conditions, in essentials the same. In other words, we indulged in the curious, and as is now utterly erroneous theory, that the African was, so to speak, an Anglo-Saxon, or if you will, a Yankee who had never had a chance. A fellow man who was guilty, as we chose to express it, of a skin not colored like our own. In other words, though carved in ebony, he was also in the image of God. Apparently, the Zeitgeist does not work in one direction. What is a Zeitgeist anyway? Here is Professor Dawkins' definition. In any society, there exists a somewhat mysterious consensus which changes over the decades, and for which it is not pretentious to use the German loanword Zeitgeist, spirit of the times. If we adopt a slightly more literal translation, we could call our mysterious phenomenon the spirit of time. And if we ignore the even more mysterious backward lurch from 1871 to 1913 and simply accept Professor Dawkins' interpretation of our spirit's action, we see that the Zeitgeist is a basically optimistic force. Its goal appears to be that history turns out for the better, again, defining better in terms of universalist ethics. Pretty nice to have around the house, wouldn't you say? In fact, Professor Dawkins' Zeitgeist is so nice that it's indistinguishable from a concept that would have been quite familiar to any member of the Adams family, the old Anglo-Calvinist or Puritan concept of providence. Perhaps this is a false match, but it's a quite close one. Now, in this case, I do agree with Moldbug pointing this out, because there was a really humorous book called Darwinist Fairy Tales by the Australian atheist philosopher David Stove. He makes exactly the same claim in much more scientific detail. I read the chapter where he talks about memes and providence and Dawkins and predestination. So I'll go with Moldbug on this one. Another word for zeitgeist is progress. It's unsurprising that universalists tend to believe in progress. In fact, in a political context, they often call themselves progressives. Universalism has indeed made quite a bit of progress since 1913, but this hardly refutes the proposition that the universalism is a parasitic tradition. Progress for the tick is not progress for the dog. Whether we call it providence, zeitgeist, or progress, the idea of a mysterious force that causes history to flow in some direction, which generally happens to be the right one, is called historicism. Karl Popper is your man on this one. Needless to say, historicism is profoundly irrational and is also rampant in the West today. We can open a newspaper without reading some sentence that makes no sense at all unless the zeitgeist is behind the curtain. Historicism also informs the consensus understanding of the recent past among even the best educated Westerners today. You have to go back 250 years to the pre-democratic era before ahistoric explanations start to predominate. Okay, so he's going to wrap this up. So far, he didn't actually do what he said he was going to do. He was going to tell us what's adaptive and what's not. He didn't really go into that at all. This long excursion about the zeitgeist, but that doesn't really tell you where these ideas come from. I'll tell you where these ideas come from. They come from the demands of a scientific society.
Yep.
Right? Because why do we have to assume that humanity is fungible? Right, for any one human, male or female, they're fungible for every other. Well, because we're a part of the machine process now, so we have to be. It's simple as.
Yeah, or at the very, very least, the idea is if they're not fungible, a sufficient level of technology and being plugged into the system can make them fungible.
Yes.
That is a fundamental thing that drives globalist capitalism.
Yes. Yes. Now that's really what's driving this. But also, where does the zeitgeist come from? Well, we know where it comes from. It comes from these nonprofit corporate think tanks that go back to the 1920s.
Yep.
The Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. That's where all these quote unquote zeitgeist ideas come from. There's no mystery here. And, given that Moldbug loves to name drop obscure old right thinkers from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, he ought to know this because those are just the thinkers that talk about this. So it's tedious.
Yep.
Recently, I read into the most astounding little book, This Ahistorical History of the French Revolution, written by an obscure Canadian historian who appears to be a specialist. Very calm and highly recommended. Imagine that all your life you've been drinking what you thought was water, but was in fact corn syrup, and then someone gave you a glass of actual water. The taste of good revisionist history is simply unmistakable. In any case, I digress. The point is that we found two thoroughly irrational themes in Universalist complex, fraternism and historicism. Well, I believe that they are irrational, but he hasn't actually demonstrated that. Notice Logos.
Yep.
It's just really nice when you can just, say things and not have to prove points.
Yeah. I'm still trying to figure out if these things are symbiotic or not. I thought I was going to we're going to get to the end and we figure out if this is symbiotic or parasitic.
We don't know yet.
I don't know yet.
Moreover, these are irrational in exactly the same sense as the Manituo delusion. They are not demonstrably false. They are just A, believed by billions of people, and B, essentially unsubstantiated. Well, the thing is, again, I'm not saying that I believe in either of those two, but B, he didn't show that. He didn't demonstrate that they're unsubstantiated.
Right.
It's a little cute talk about the soul, but given the idea of political equality does not come from the soul. Read Hobbes. He doesn't mention the soul when he talks about political equality. Neither does Rousseau.
Right. And one thing that just dawned on me is he flip-flops between the oughtness of political equality and the descriptive fact in question about whether people are interchangeable. Those aren't the same question.
Yeah. We can extend this list with two irrational universalist themes I've discussed before, Rawlsianism and pacifism. I mean, what is he talking about, pacifism? The sort of far left in America is always running around, burning things down, shooting people. What is he talking about?
I have no idea.
And whatever. And there is a fifth, which I haven't yet given its due, communalism, the error of ascribing individual identity to neo-hominid groups. I think I've done a fair job of demonstrating irrationality for at least the first 4. He didn't even create an argument. I don't even know what he's talking about. Irrationality implies at least trivial morbidity. I think I'll leave this task of showing non-trivial morbidity for fraternalism and historicism to the reader's imagination, of which I don't think it makes any particularly erroneous demands. Oh, well, there you go, Logos! It's up to your imagination. I'm not going to actually prove it.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. That's pretty convenient.
Hey, it's almost as convenient as that little Zeitgeist that, flips the script. I mean, can you prove it's false, bro?
Yeah. Good point.
However, I haven't really discussed adaptiveness. No, he didn't, Logos.
No, he didn't.
And if we want to demonstrate ponage, we have to show adaptiveness, because irrational themes could be in some way accidental or transient, a result of a thematic drift, as it were. If the irrationalists do not contribute to the reproductive success of universalism, they'll probably go away on their own, and they are much less worrisome. Thus, describing Professor Dawkins as pwned may be a stretch. I'll start trying some of these ends together in chapter 4.
Man, I hope so.
Well, dude, Logos, famous last words. How often have we heard these things? Oh, we're gonna tie it up. Trust me. We're gonna tie it up. Trust me.
We'll try it up. We'll see.
Oh boy. Okay. Oh, okay. Chapter 4 for next week. But yeah, Dawkins got pwned. I mean, he's not. I don't know why this is so popular. Maybe he gets better in 4, 5, 6, and 7, but I'm not seeing it right now.
I think it's literally only popular because it gave people kind of like a platform to be like, look, the IQ question or whatever they wanted to talk about. Like that was the first edge.
Yeah, probably so. I don't know. I mean, a lot of stupid nonsense coming from Moldbug. Same old, same old. I don't know if there's anything new we want to add. At least not me.
I mean, the Protestant thesis was already treaded and retreaded. Like, I'm surprised we spent as much time on that part as we did. But, and the novel part where he's supposed to talk about adaptivity and whatnot, he didn't even get to this time. I don't even know what that last thing was, to be honest with you. It was just goofy.
It was a waste of time.
Yeah.
Well, and he didn't even prove that those beliefs were false. He just kind of made fun of them. But that's okay. And
yeah, I mean, I don't know why he calls them irrational instead of undecidable. Right? So undecidable is something that can't be proved true or false. For example, the continuum hypothesis is undecidable under ZFC, Zermelo-Franco set theory, right? Like, we already have a word for that. Irrational would have to be like, it's not even a proposition that's subject to logical evaluation. It'd be something like, I don't know, error theory. That's all moral propositions are false. Like non-cognitivism, right? It'd have to be like a non-cognitive state rather than a proposition in order to be like irrational, I think, in the sense that he means it, rather than undecidable. But it seems right now we just have a statement that's undecidable because it seems that it's a fact that could be true or false. We just don't know whether it's true or false.
Right. So just briefly for your benefit, Logos, he defines irrational thus. It was from the one that you jumped in late. If a theme is not justified by reason, we call it irrational. Metaphysical themes are irrational by definition. Mundane themes are irrational. If they depend on logical fallacies or violate Occam's razor, no single ethical theme can be irrational, but a set of ethical claims is irrational if it describes mutually inconsistent ethical values to a single action. That's his definition.
That is a terrible definition.
Most things with Moldbug are terrible. Well, that's all I got. So, do you have anything you want to add before we just wrap this up?
I'm still thinking about that definition. Can you read that again?
Yeah. You know what? I'm just going to put it up on the screen.
Put it up on the screen. That's going to be my contribution. I want to see what the heck is this. Is such a weird definition.
There we go.
Okay, if a theme is not justified by reason, we call it irrational. Okay, well, there we go. So his idea that we haven't proven this thing true or false then doesn't make it irrational, because you can still take a justified position on something reasonably, even if it's not proved definitively true or false.
Hey, you know what? Is his definition of irrationality rationally defined?
That's a good point.
Keep going.
let's see. Metaphysical themes are irrational by definition. Well, hold on. What else would any metaphysical theme be justified by other than reason? The entire point of metaphysics is to build a schema by which you interpret empirical claims.
Yes.
So if you're trying to justify a schema as opposed to another schema, the only justification, since it's not empirical, you're justifying empirical interpretation, that you have to justify it by reason. What is he talking about? Mundane themes are irrational if they defend logical fallacies or violate Occam's razor. Well, maybe, maybe not, right? So you can be fallacious and be justified by some reasons, just not justified by all reasons. So so I've seen some invalid arguments, for example, that you could like clean up, and they still convey basically what the arguer wanted to convey, but now the argument's valid. And a lot of fallacies, most of fallacies are informal fallacies, right? And informal fallacies are like the slippery slope, for example, right? Slippery slope is basically induction. So you can take an argument, interpret it very, very narrowly deductively when it's meant to be inductively interpreted. Claim a slippery slope fallacy, and yet the slippery slope people are right in the end. So it turns out reason was justifying their skepticism on a particular thing. What is he talking about? Okay, or violate Occam's razor. Okay, it's not clear how he intends to violate Occam's razor. Like, look, in order to determine, okay, this gets back to your question about whether his principle is justified. Let's think about this, right? The only way you know whether something violates Occam's razor is if there's a ceteris paribus condition, all else equal condition, on what two models are trying to explain, and one model is needlessly then, adding entities over the other model. The only way you know a ceteris paribus condition has been demonstrated isn't via the empirical method. This is purely schematic. It's categorical, right? This is done before empirical work is done on the hypothesis testing part. The only way you know if a ceteris paribus condition in terms of explanatory powers being done is via a metaphysical framework. But he just said the metaphysical framework, their themes are irrational. So his use of we cannot violate Occam's razor is a metaphysical framework.
Is irrational.
Which is irrational. So you're onto something. His entire definition is an irrational definition.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
How? Logos, how did this guy get to where he's at?
It's irrational if it describes mutually inconsistent ethical values to a single action. Well, of course you can describe different ethical values to a single action. This is why I failed John Haidt's moral foundations tests, right? I took a John Haidt's foundation test once, and I couldn't answer the first question. So here's the first question. The first question was, okay, let's suppose you have a friend at school, and your friend wants to be the prom queen or something. And let's suppose your friend's a little overweight or something, and you have some options. Like, what do you say to your friend? Do you say to your friend, hey, you're overweight, you probably don't got a good chance? Do you lie to them? Basically, is what would you do? It's like, I think there might have been more than two options, but the entire point was, no, there were two options, and the test claimed to tell you your value based on the two options you did. So what if I told her that she was overweight, not to be mean or even to be bluntly honest, but to say, if I tell you soon enough that you're overweight and have a low chance, maybe we can work out or something, like go exercise or whatever, and get you in shape to give you a better chance of winning. Maybe I tell her that I had notes on this question, but I had like 5 different reasons I could give the same answer on like telling her the truth. And then I had like 5 different reasons I can give for telling her the lie. So for example, Haidt would say, well, if you lie to your friend, it means that you're like, you value your friend's feelings over facts, and there's like different dimensions based on that or whatever. But I'm like, what if I lied to my friend because I'm a sociopath and just want to see her like fall on her face? I could be absolutely evil too. This might not just be like a social faux pas thing, like, oh, I don't want to hurt her feelings. No, maybe I'm an absolute jerk and want to see her fall on her face. Like, there's so many different ways, values you could map the same action to, that it's like almost impossible. So this idea is mutually it's irrational if it ascribes mutually inconsistent ethical values to a single action. It's like, this is why I can't do John Haidt's test. This is because I can attribute different values to basically the same action. It doesn't make any sense. I don't know what's going on here.
I don't. You know what? If anybody knows what's going on inside Mencius Moldbug's brain, then I don't know. They deserve a Nobel Prize or something.
Well, thank you for pulling that back up, because I had to look at this. Like, you read it to me, and I didn't hear it all. And I'm like, no, it couldn't be as stupid as it sounded the first time. Pull it up again. And now that I read it, it's like, it's stupider than it sounded the first time. What?
That's Moldbug for you. Okay.
There we go. I think going over that is basically my sum of the entire thing. The Protestant thing wet the bed just as much. He never got the thing he promised us about things being symbiotic or parasitic. That whole last article was kind of like goofy. I didn't know what his point was. All these giant quotes and Zeitgeist and things like that. It's like trying to prove something was irrational when it didn't really meet his definition, because even though they hadn't proven it true or false doesn't mean it couldn't be justified one way or the other by a reason. It's an open statistical question. Like, the whole thing was a mess.
Yeah, it was real bad. Well, all right, everyone. Thanks for suffering with Logos and I. I'm exasperated and Logos is confused. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.